The early morning sun stretched over the sprawling fields of Charleston, South Carolina, bathing the rows of crops in a soft, golden glow. The Montgomery family farm had been in their family for 3 generations, its weathered barns standing like a sentinel of time and history. Birds chirped lazily as the morning breeze stirred the tall grass. Sarah Montgomery stood on the porch, her hand shading her eyes as she scanned the distance. She could see the silhouette of a man near the hayloft, lifting bales with practiced ease. From this distance, she could almost convince herself it was her husband, Daniel, strong and steady. But it wasn't. It was Cole Evans, the newest farmhand they had hired during harvest season. His sun-bronzed skin glistened in the morning light, his movements deliberate and powerful. There was something about him that unnerved her, something unspoken. Sarah shook her head, willing herself to push away the thoughts creeping into her mind. The day unfolded with its usual rhythm. Daniel worked with the accountants in the office, buried under a mountain of logistics, while Sarah oversaw the workers and helped prepare lunch for everyone on the farm. She was beloved by the farmhands for her warmth and generosity, always bringing lemonade or fresh biscuits to the fields. When Sarah brought the pitcher to the barn, she found Cole adjusting the straps of the hay bales. "You work harder than anyone else here," she said, handing him a glass. Cole smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that made her pulse race. "Just trying to earn my keep." The moment stretched between them, the air thick with something unspoken. Sarah quickly looked away, her cheeks flushed. "Well, you're doing a fine job." Cole's voice was soft but pointed. "Coming from you, that means a lot." She swallowed hard and turned back toward the house, her heart beating faster than it should. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned shades of amber and violet, Daniel joined Sarah on the porch, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He was thoughtful, a man of few words but plenty of love. "You've been quiet today," Daniel noted. Sarah smiled weakly. "Just tired." Daniel nodded, though a flicker of concern passed through his eyes. "Harvest season's always hard on you." She leaned into his shoulder, closing her eyes and wishing she could silence the restless thoughts in her mind. The next morning, Sarah wandered to the fields before dawn, needing solitude. The air was cool and smelled of dew-covered earth. As she passed the barn, she heard the soft creak of the hayloft ladder. She looked up and saw Cole. "You're up early," he called down, his voice low but unmistakable. "So are you," she replied, stepping inside. The smell of fresh hay filled the space, thick and warm. Cole descended the ladder slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Sometimes I like to be alone with the quiet." Sarah's breath caught as he stepped closer. She could see every line of his face, the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "This isn't right," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Cole's voice was a quiet storm. "Then tell me to stop." The hayloft seemed to close in around them, the rest of the world fading away. Sarah's resolve shattered as Cole reached for her, his touch electric. The first kiss was hesitant, then desperate. They stumbled into the soft piles of hay, lost in a moment that would change everything. Sarah spent the following days in a haze of guilt and exhilaration. She told herself it had been a mistake, a fleeting lapse in judgment. But Cole's presence was magnetic, pulling her back again and again. They met in the barn under the cover of twilight, in the fields when the sun was high, hidden behind the swaying cornstalks where no one would see. Their affair was wild and reckless, woven into the fabric of the very land they walked. Yet, no secret stays buried forever. One afternoon, as Sarah returned from the field, she spotted Daniel watching her from the porch. His expression was calm, but his eyes held something she hadn't seen before: suspicion. "Everything okay?" she asked, forcing a smile. Daniel took a long sip of his bourbon, his gaze steady. "That depends, doesn't it?" Sarah's stomach twisted with unease. The cracks in their perfect life were beginning to show. The morning after Daniel's quiet comment on the porch, Sarah woke to a heavy sense of unease. The golden sunlight streaming into the room felt hollow, and every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet seemed louder than usual. She watched Daniel as he sat at the breakfast table, reading the morning paper. His face was calm, but there was an unmistakable tension in the way he held his coffee cup. Heading into town today? Sarah asked, attempting to sound casual. Daniel nodded without looking up. Need to pick up some supplies. Sarah bit her lip. I could come with you. Daniel finally met her gaze, his eyes softening for a moment before darkening again. No need. You've got plenty to do here. She nodded, her heart sinking. The Montgomery farm was always bustling during harvest season. Workers moved like clockwork through the fields, their laughter and shouts blending with the hum of machinery. Sarah walked among them with a forced smile, handing out fresh lemonade and biscuits. But her thoughts were miles away. Cole was at the far end of the field, loading crates onto a truck. His shirt was soaked with sweat, clinging to his shoulders. When he caught her looking, he paused and gave her a subtle nod, a silent invitation. Sarah's pulse quickened. She turned away, willing herself to focus. That afternoon, Sarah took refuge in the shaded coolness of the barn. The familiar scent of hay was comforting, but it did little to calm her nerves. A rustling sound behind her made her jump. Cole appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. You shouldn't come here alone, he said, his voice low. Sarah crossed her arms. Neither should you. He stepped closer, his eyes filled with something between regret and longing. Is that what you really want? She looked away, but the truth hung in the air. It doesn't matter what I want. It should, Cole replied. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze. Sarah's heart pounded as Daniel's voice echoed from outside the barn. Sarah? You in there? She stepped out from behind the stacks of hay, smoothing her dress. I'm here. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. His eyes flicked to Cole, then back to Sarah. Everything all right? Sarah forced a smile. Of course. Daniel's gaze lingered for a moment before he nodded. Good. We need to talk later. She swallowed hard as he walked away, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Later that evening, after dinner, Daniel led Sarah to the porch. The setting sun cast a fiery glow across the fields. I've been noticing things, Daniel began, his voice steady but cold. Sarah's stomach twisted. What do you mean? Daniel's eyes locked onto hers. You're different, Sarah. Distant. She struggled to find the right words. It's just the stress of harvest season. He shook his head. It's more than that. Silence settled between them like a thick fog. Finally, Daniel spoke again. I love you, but I'm not blind. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. I love you too. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then you need to tell me the truth. Sarah looked away, the truth too heavy to bear. The following days passed like a blur. The weight of Daniel's suspicions followed Sarah everywhere she went. She avoided Cole as much as she could, but their paths inevitably crossed in the fields and the barn. One afternoon, as she carried a basket of vegetables to the workers, Allison Hastings, a close friend of the family, approached her. Allison was sharp-eyed and perceptive, with a knack for picking up on unspoken things. You've seemed distracted lately, Allison noted, her voice laced with concern. Sarah forced a smile. It's just the season. Allison narrowed her eyes. If you ever need to talk, you know where to find me. Sarah nodded, grateful but wary. Allison meant well, but Sarah knew that too many questions could unravel everything. That night, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Daniel slept beside her. She wondered how much longer she could carry the weight of her choices. She got up quietly and stepped outside. The night air was cool, and the stars stretched endlessly overhead. She thought about the life they had built, the love that had once been so certain, and wondered if it could ever be whole again. But deep down, she knew the cracks were widening. The morning air was heavy with the promise of rain as Sarah stood by the kitchen window, watching the horizon darken. The world outside felt like a reflection of her inner turmoil, quiet yet threatening to unravel. Daniel had left early, saying something vague about handling repairs near the eastern fence. His absence should have been a relief, but it only deepened Sarah's unease. She knew that whatever conversation they had last night was only the beginning. Cole was loading sacks of grain into the storage shed when Sarah approached, her footsteps light but purposeful. We need to stop, she said without preamble, her voice trembling. Cole set the sack down and wiped his hands, his brow furrowed. Is that what you really want? Sarah hugged herself, as if trying to hold her breaking pieces together. It doesn't matter what I want. It's what has to happen. Cole took a step closer, his eyes softening. I don't believe that. She shook her head. You don't understand. Daniel's starting to see things. He's asking questions. Cole's jaw clenched. Then let me leave. I can pack up, move on. Maybe that's what's best. Sarah's heart lurched at the thought. The idea of Cole disappearing from her life felt like a deeper loss than she could bear. No, she whispered, tears brimming. It's not that simple. Then what do you want me to do? Cole asked, his voice raw. Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps and voices drifted toward the shed. Sarah backed away, her face pale. We can't talk here. Cole nodded, but said nothing as Sarah disappeared toward the house. By late afternoon, a storm had rolled in, casting the sky in shades of gray. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Daniel returned home, his boots caked in mud. Sarah was in the living room, trying to steady herself with a book she wasn't reading. Daniel's entrance was quiet, but his presence was anything but. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed. We need to have that talk. Sarah closed the book slowly and looked up. All right. Daniel pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down, his eyes dark with something she couldn't place. Grief or fury, or maybe both. I spoke to Allison today, Daniel began. Sarah's stomach dropped. Why? She asked if we were okay. Sarah forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She worries too much. Daniel leaned forward. Does she? The room was thick with tension as the rain began to tap against the windows. Sarah felt trapped, caught between the weight of her choices and Daniel's growing awareness. I'm not going to dance around this, Sarah, Daniel said, his voice low and steady. I know something's been happening, and I think you know what I'm talking about. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Daniel, don't lie to me, he interrupted, his voice sharper than she'd ever heard it. Is it Cole? The name hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah's world seemed to tilt. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, the truth breaking free in a single, devastating moment. Yes. Daniel's face twisted in pain as he stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. How long? Sarah wiped her eyes, struggling to speak. A few months. He slammed his hand against the wall, the sound reverberating through the house. My God, Sarah. Why? Her voice cracked. I don't know. I was lonely. I was lost. Daniel turned toward her, his face pale but resolute. You've destroyed us. Sarah reached for him, desperate. Please, Daniel. I still love you. He stepped back as if her touch would burn him. No, you don't get to say that. The storm outside raged as silence fell between them. Daniel grabbed his coat and keys, his movements mechanical. Where are you going? Sarah asked, panic rising. Out, he said coldly, to figure out what happens next. The door slammed behind him, leaving Sarah alone with the storm. Daniel drove aimlessly through the rain-soaked streets, his mind a whirlwind of betrayal and rage. He thought about the years they'd spent building their life, the dreams they'd shared, and how quickly it had all unraveled. But beneath the anger was something else, a quiet, simmering resolve. He pulled over near a diner, the neon sign flickering in the rain. He reached for his phone and made a call. Reed. Daniel's voice was calm but sharp. I need your help. Back at the farm, Sarah sat in the dark, listening to the rain pound against the roof. She had no idea where Daniel had gone or what he planned to do. All she knew was that their world had finally shattered, and there was no going back. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the world outside felt eerily still. Puddles shimmered under the weak morning sun, and the Montgomery farm seemed to hold its breath. Sarah woke to the sound of the front door opening and closing. She sat up, her heart pounding. Footsteps echoed through the house until Daniel appeared in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion. Daniel, Sarah began, standing cautiously. He held up a hand. Sit. The word was sharp, cold. She obeyed, lowering herself back onto the couch. Daniel took a seat across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. I spoke with Reed last night, he said quietly. Sarah's stomach twisted. She knew Reed, an old friend of Daniel's who had a reputation for uncovering things others wanted to keep hidden. What did you tell him? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel's gaze pinned her in place. Enough. The word hung in the air like a sentence. Later that day, Sarah walked through the farm, trying to calm her nerves. The workers greeted her as they passed, unaware of the storm that had ripped through her life. Cole was working near the back barn, stacking bales of hay. He looked up when he saw her approaching. You shouldn't be here, he said, glancing around. Sarah's eyes were glassy with unshed tears. Daniel knows. Cole's face hardened. Then I'll go. She shook her head. You don't understand. He's not just angry. He's planning something. Cole stepped closer, his voice low but fierce. I won't let him hurt you. Sarah's heart broke at the sincerity in his eyes. This isn't about protecting me. It's too late for that. Cole reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her resolve shaking. You should leave, Cole. If you stay, it'll only get worse. His jaw clenched, but he nodded. If that's what you want. Tears slipped down her cheeks. It's what has to happen. That night, Daniel sat alone in his study, the room dimly lit by the glow of a desk lamp. In front of him was a manila folder filled with photos Reed had sent, pictures of Sarah and Cole, their secret moments captured in painful clarity. Daniel's hands trembled as he closed the folder. The pain was suffocating, but beneath it was a dangerous clarity. The next morning, the first whispers of Daniel's plans began to spread. 2 days later, Sarah woke to find Cole's small cabin near the workers' quarters empty. His truck was gone, the place stripped bare of his belongings. She felt the hollowness settle in her chest. Despite everything, she hadn't wanted it to end like this. At breakfast, Daniel sat across from her, calm and composed. He's gone, he said matter-of-factly, sipping his coffee. Sarah's eyes widened. You forced him out. Daniel set his mug down with a soft thud. He left because he knew what was coming. Her hands shook as she pushed her plate away. This isn't justice, Daniel. He leaned forward, his voice like steel. It's survival. The news of Cole's departure spread quickly, but no one asked questions. In a town like theirs, whispers only lingered when people dared to listen. Sarah spent her days in silence, walking through the fields as if searching for something she'd lost. Her heart was heavy with grief, not just for Cole, but for the life she'd destroyed. One evening, she found Daniel standing by the old oak tree near the pond, the place where they'd had their first picnic years ago. He didn't turn as she approached. I thought this place would feel the same, Daniel said quietly, but it doesn't. Sarah stood beside him, wrapping her arms around herself. Nothing feels the same anymore. Daniel exhaled slowly. I loved you more than anything. Tears streamed down her face. I know. He finally turned to her, and for the first time, she saw the full depth of his pain. But love can't fix this. She nodded, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry, Daniel. His expression softened, but there was no relief. So am I. That night, Daniel packed a small bag. Sarah watched from the doorway as he zipped it shut. Where are you going? She asked, her voice trembling. Daniel didn't meet her eyes. I need time away, to figure out who I am without all of this. Sarah felt her chest tighten. Will you come back? Daniel paused, his back to her. I don't know. The front door closed softly behind him, and the silence that followed was absolute. The next few weeks passed like a slow, painful blur. Sarah stayed on the farm, pouring herself into work, trying to mend what was left. But the empty spaces Daniel and Cole had left behind haunted her. One morning, a letter arrived in the mailbox. The envelope was plain, but her heart recognized the handwriting immediately. Sarah, I don't know where this road will take me, but I hope you find peace. We both deserve that, even if it takes time. Take care of yourself. Daniel. Tears blurred her vision as she read the words over and over. Months later, as autumn settled over the farm, Sarah found herself standing near the pond beneath the oak tree. The air was cool, and the leaves were beginning to change. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The echoes of the past still lingered, But for the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of something new, a quiet strength. Some endings weren't about destruction. Sometimes they were about survival. Autumn gave way to winter, and the Montgomery farm lay quiet under a blanket of frost. The days were shorter, and the fields stood empty, waiting for spring's renewal. But for Sarah, the farm felt like a relic of her past, a past she couldn't quite escape. She filled her days with work, fixing broken fences, mending old shutters, and tending to the animals. The physical labor kept her mind occupied, but it did little to dull the ache in her chest. One evening, after closing up the barn, Sarah returned to the house and found an envelope sitting on the kitchen table. The handwriting was unfamiliar but precise. "You deserve to know the truth." Her heart pounded as she opened it. Inside were copies of reports from the private investigator Reed had hired. Each page detailed Daniel's methodical plan, not just to expose the affair, but to ensure Cole would never find work nearby again. Daniel had pulled every string he could, making sure Cole's reputation was tainted. Sarah sank into a chair, the weight of the papers crushing her. Daniel's calm departure hadn't been an act of healing. It had been the final move in a cold, calculated revenge. Weeks later, Sarah decided she couldn't stay on the farm. The memories were suffocating. She packed a few belongings and drove into town, renting a small cottage on the edge of the woods. It was modest but warm, filled with sunlight that streamed through the windows in the mornings. She took up painting again, something she hadn't done in years. The act of brushing colors onto a canvas gave her a sense of quiet control, a chance to rewrite the story in her mind. Daniel, meanwhile, had moved to Asheville, North Carolina. The mountains provided the solitude he craved. He rented a cabin overlooking a lake and spent his days hiking, reading, and reflecting. But the peace he sought remained elusive. One evening, he received an unexpected call from Allison. "I ran into Sarah," she said, her voice gentle. Daniel closed his eyes. "How is she?" "She's different. Stronger, I think, but still healing." Daniel hesitated. "Did she mention me?" Allison's pause was brief but telling. "No, but I think she still feels the loss." Daniel thanked her and hung up. He sat by the window, staring at the reflection of the moon on the lake's surface. He had won the war he'd waged, but at what cost? Months later, a letter arrived at Sarah's cottage. The handwriting was unmistakably Daniel's. "Sarah, I've had time to think. Time to understand what I became when everything fell apart. I hurt you. I hurt myself. I thought revenge would bring me closure, but it only left me emptier. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve that. I just want you to know that I regret everything. The secrets, the silence, the aftermath. I hope you find the happiness I couldn't give you. Take care. Daniel." Sarah read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of her desk. The pain was still there, but his words felt like the beginning of something softer, something that could eventually fade. One spring afternoon, Sarah attended a local art fair to showcase some of her paintings. The event was bustling with laughter and conversation, but Sarah felt calm as she watched people admire her work. She noticed a familiar figure across the courtyard. Daniel stood by a booth, hands in his coat pockets, watching her. Their eyes met across the space, and time seemed to slow. Sarah felt a wave of emotions, pain, nostalgia, and something else she couldn't quite name. Daniel approached, his steps tentative. "Hi, Sarah." "Hi." They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the fair fading into the background. "You're showing your art," Daniel said, gesturing to the paintings. "They're beautiful." Sarah smiled, a genuine smile that felt strange and familiar at the same time. "Thank you." Daniel hesitated. "I didn't come here to disrupt your life. I was just passing through." Sarah nodded, her heart steady. "You're not disrupting anything." Another pause. Then she asked, "How are you?" Daniel's eyes softened. "Better. Still figuring things out." "Me too," she admitted. They spoke for a few more minutes before Daniel glanced at the time. "I should go." Sarah nodded. "Take care, Daniel." He smiled, a quiet, bittersweet smile. "You too." As he walked away, Sarah felt no regret, only a quiet acceptance of what had been and what would never be again. That evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Sarah returned home and stood by her window, watching the golden light fade. Life was uncertain, but she was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. In the quiet of her cottage, she painted late into the night, filling the canvas with the colors of her resilience. Some endings weren't about losing. Sometimes they were about finding yourself again. End of story.